Thank you again for joining us. We're keeping on schedule, and would you please welcome Kelly Barsdate.
I should begin my remarks today with a modest disclaimer. I am, in some ways, an innovation skeptic, right? I am suspicious of buzzwords. I'm not sure how smart I want my phone to be, actually. And I am a little tired of being told that I need the latest innovation in driving performance or dental hygiene products. I also have a decent relationship with my toaster. Okay. So I get pretty cranky at being told I need a different solution for something until the thing I was using stopped working. And we've all had this happen to us, right? Our bagels get burned. Or a medication we used to rely on no longer works for our bodies. Or something bigger in our environment shifts. It shifts our fundamental assumptions about the security or safety of the future, like our house loses half of its market value. You know, this is actually, I love being up here. It's kind of like being in the Bat Cave or the Art Womb or something like that. I feel very nurtured. I feel very nurtured. So the work of artists and arts organizations is susceptible to many kinds of changes too. So that leads me to the question of, is our toaster optimized for the arts? All right. And I lead with a question. I'm a keynote speaker, but I lead with the questions, and that's because I'm kind of a walking science experiment. I was raised by a scientist and by also the former chair of the State Arts Council in Alaska, right? So it means that I am fulfilling my genetic destiny when I study the arts for a living. And one of the things that makes the arts so wonderful to study is the contours, the textures, the questions that we all ask as creators, and the questions that we invite our communities and the people around us to explore and ask as well. So the first question of the day is our arts toaster optimized? And as Susan said, I am a little bit of an information hound, so I'll start with some of those. Last week, the NEA and NORC, the National Opinion Research Center in Chicago, released a long-term study on arts participation and arts learning. You actually, in your Oasis packets, have a copy of some of that information. And it found today that fewer than half of adults are receiving any childhood arts education. And we are reaping the results of that in our audience figures. Attendance of the live arts among young adults is in sharp decline, and baby boomers too are attending the arts at much, much lower rates than their parents used to. Now, these patterns look a little different from discipline to discipline, but I'll pull out just one to illustrate, and that was done by research by Oliver Wyman Associates on symphonies. And they found that among orchestra audiences, half of audience members are first-timers, but 80% of those never come back. All right, so we're hemorrhaging potential there. At the same time, we've got a surge of arts participation through digital media. Millions of people are consuming the arts and creating the arts quite avidly across all age groups. But meanwhile, back at the bank, only 16% of arts nonprofits projected that they would close fiscal 2010 with any kind of budget surplus. Do the math, that means that 84%, yeah. The share of private sector giving going to the arts has fallen to its lowest point in the last decade, and public funding for the arts too, particularly at the state level, is going through really hard times. Now, just to be clear, I'm not one of those critics who believes that the nonprofit arts industry as we know it is doomed to demise. Right? I do not believe that these facts point to that conclusion. What I do mean, though, is that they indicate some tectonic shifts in our arts environment. And they challenge us to come up with some new ways to think about how we do our work, how we share that work, how we engage new audiences and new creators in it, and how we make that case, how we talk about it in the public sphere and convey the relevance and the resonance of the arts to policy decision makers and to our neighbors, and make the arts a part of everyday life. So, next question. When Susan and I were talking about this keynote a few days ago, she said, I want you to define innovation, because we use that term in a lot of different ways. So that's a little bit of a daunting task, because there are hundreds of definitions out there. To help me wrap my head around it, I did a download of definitions from Fast Company, CNET, Harvard Business Review, Fortune, and for good measure, I tossed in analysis from several arts consulting firms and foundations that specifically fund change management, social entrepreneurship, and have innovation programs, or what they call innovation programs. And that's what you get when you stick it all into Wordle and use that as a content analysis tool. You get this graph. Now, the size of these words is weighted according to their frequency of use, but the associations and the placement is random. Several things to notice about this. Of course, there's a lot of emphasis on change, on newness, on creative ideas. No surprise there. But there's also a lot, if you look more closely, you start to see other themes. We see words associated with gain or success, but words with a lot of ambiguity, words like failure and risk, are sometimes even bigger. They're sometimes ranked even higher. We often use the word innovation as a noun to describe a new product, but look here at the emphasis given to process words. We also see more words about people than about technology, interestingly. And I love the crazy maybe strategy. I've had a couple of those myself. All of these themes, failure, people, and process, are going to be important in the examples of innovation that I'll share with you shortly. But to set the stage for that, let's tighten the definition just a little further. And to do that, I'm going to invoke two muses, one old and one new. Our first muse is the granddaddy of innovation theory, an economist by the name of Joseph Schumpeter, who worked in the 1940s. Now, Schumpeter is an interesting guy. He is simultaneously worshipped and mocked by modern economists. All right? He's mocked because he predicted the downfall, the complete collapse of capitalism, which so far hasn't happened. But he's also respected because he was one of the first people to systematize, evaluate, document, and build theories around innovation, change, creativity, and entrepreneurship. And his writings are still required reading in many business schools today. Now, Schumpeter makes a distinction between invention and innovation, which is really important. Invention, he says, is the birth of new ideas, like new products or new services, or in the arts, new programs. Innovation is about creative ways to bring those ideas to market. Now, this is an important nuance, because from Schumpeter we learned that a fresh idea all by itself is not enough. Actual innovation doesn't occur until people find the way to give it legs, to bring new ideas to audiences or to consumers. Now, invention is clearly a strong suit of our arts field, right? We are always coming up with new ideas and new works all the time. We're constantly experimenting with new mediums and designing new programs. Our greater challenge, like Susan was saying earlier, is about ways to bring those programs or products to market and to make them part of everyday life. Let's move to a second guy, a second muse, more modern muse, by the name of Lawrence Gonzalez. All right. Lawrence wrote a book called Deep Survival. It's a study of catastrophic events like avalanches, plane crashes, and being marooned at sea. I first read this book actually when I was flying in an airplane at about 30,000 feet above the Alaska Range. It was not one of my brightest moments with that timing. Anyway, Gonzalez suggests 12 rules of survival that I was studying up on at that moment, that I think every arts manager ought to know, whether the avalanche you're in is literal or figurative. And one of those is about the essential importance of being able to abandon our old mental models. His research found that being able to perceive the unexpected played a powerful role in determining the survival of the 9/11 tragedy and other disasters. However, the way our brains are structured makes this really difficult to achieve. The task orientation of our minds, and by extension, I believe, the mission orientation of our nonprofit organizations too, can create big blind spots for us. This was illustrated by a team of Harvard psychologists. Some of you will be familiar with this experiment. Their experiment involved showing a video of a basketball team passing a ball back and forth. The researchers asked some experimental viewers to count the number of passes made by the team as they were watching the video. Now, in the middle of the film, one of two strange things would happen. Either a woman with an umbrella or a person in a gorilla costume would walk across the center of the action, remaining clearly visible for 5 seconds. Afterwards, the subjects of the experiment were asked if they saw anything odd. 35% of the viewers failed to see the woman with the umbrella. 56 didn't notice the gorilla. When the researchers asked them, "Did you see the gorilla?" they said, "The what?" Now, a control group of people who were not told to count the passes easily saw both the woman with the umbrella and the gorilla. Why? Because they weren't as fixated on task or mission. In other words, when they looked up at the screen, they did so with the simple attitude of, what's going on? What might I see? So that skill of being able to perceive the new or the unexpected is an essential disaster survival skill. It's also an essential arts survival skill, and it's the third ingredient of our innovation equation. So to recap, innovation requires three components: insight, or an ability to see things differently, which is something I believe we are fundamentally strong in the arts. Two, the invention of an idea or a product. And three, a viable pathway to market. So this all sounds pretty straightforward. It even fits on a t-shirt. So if it's so simple, then when and how and why is innovation so difficult for us in the arts? Richard Evans summed it up this way, and some of this is mentioned in another article you have in your Oasis packets. For instance, consider how a lot of arts organizations get their money, right? If you're lucky enough to have an endowment, that's about stability. Annual campaigns for fundraising, subscriptions for tickets, all these provide revenue continuity, which is really good if you need to do bookings and advanced planning up to a year or two at a time. But none of which are terribly elastic mechanisms to respond to changing funding conditions. There are other forces at play too, of course. Many funders put pressure on arts organizations to achieve success. They are much less interested in us telling them about our failures. They also tell us to minimize overhead and administrative costs. And there is sometimes a way bigger seasonal audience for the Nutcracker than for anything else, with much smaller audiences for new or avant-garde works. Now, these factors may apply more or less to you, depending on your art form or the size or capital structure of your budget. But one factor that tends to apply across the board to most of the arts organizations I've worked with is lack of slack. Slack is a term management analysts use to describe flexible resources above those needed for basic operations. And those are available then to fuel innovation or change. And we've got a shortage of that in the arts for sure. So this is the moment in most innovation keynotes that I've seen where the speaker launches into the case study of somebody really famous, like Starbucks or Google, to talk about how they innovated to capture massive market share. And those are great stories, and I'm not going to tell them now. All right? You can look them up online. What I am going to focus on instead is innovation of a much more modest scale, the kind that does not require a multi-million R&D budget, the kind that does not require celebrity endorsements, the kind that does not require a team of global venture capitalists. I'm going to share three arts examples with you and talk about lessons learned and common denominators. And I'm deliberately using the word sampler here to evoke that sense we get from quilters of small pieces, lovingly crafted, blending old with new, creation and reuse, and framing different combinations of things. Some of these examples will also be programmatic, not just advocacy, because I do believe that it's in the programmatic realm that most people experience and intersect with the arts, and that is the moment then where we can open their minds to the necessity of speaking up and speaking out as advocates as well. So first, Big Sky Country. There's a little town by the name of Miles City in Custer County, Montana, one of the most remote parts of the state. Miles City is small, about 8,500 people, surrounded by acres of ranch land with population density of less than 1 person per square mile. Trips into town are really rare for ranch families, and people driving by on I-94 tend to whiz right by on that highway without ever pulling off into the town. So that's the soil in which this contemporary art center is blooming. All right? The Custer County Heritage and Arts Center is a small organization dedicated to promoting new works and emerging visual artists. Now, the center had to come to grips with a couple of things. The first was a local attitude towards new works. There's a quote from the center director. He said, "Contemporary art is our love and our passion, but there's a whole population out there who could care less. We have to find some way to hook them in." So they realized that the traditional values of the community might be an asset rather than an obstacle. Local pride, pride in place. Some of the speakers earlier today talked about that pride in place. Big thing in Miles City. So if the center could tap into that sentiment, they could develop deeper relationships with patrons. So thinking back to our three-part equation, that was one of the insights they had. The second was that they had to do something different to attract tourist traffic off of the highway. They knew the resident population was on a decline, and if they were going to grow programs, they had to get a piece of that pie. Now, here's some of the solutions or inventions that they came up with. First was to pilot an exhibit that blended heritage with contemporary works. The show is called Driven, and it involved photographs and paintings of early travel routes in the history of the town, and combined with new works by local artists on the themes of vehicles, movement, and transformation, and a display of classic cars and motorcycles. The event was timed to coincide with the annual motorcycle rally in Sturgis, and it worked. Waves of bikers came into the gallery, and locals did too. The director tells a story of several locals coming in, looking around, dropping their jaw, walking back out again, pulling out their cell phones and calling their wives or their buddies and saying, "You got to come see this." Now, the this was two things. Yes, it was the art, but it was also the buzz. It was also the event. It was also the fabulosity of what was happening. Okay? The second thing the center did was to apply to the Montana DOT for signage waivers along local highways. They partnered with the Range Riders Museum to install 6 billboards. They've covered all approaches into a town. They've got 2 on I-94, and they've also got them on secondary roads. These draw not just visitors, but they also remind locals. And they help the two organizations cross-pollinate. Now, the center has continued this approach of blending old and new and putting new works in the context of local history or the national environment. And you can see they've had a 39% increase in gallery attendance and a 10% increase in membership since they started. Second example I'll mention is from over east, Elizabeth Streb in New York. Now, some of you will be familiar with the Streb style, which is a fusion of dance, athletics, circus arts, and several other things that defy both my words and gravity all at the same time. Anyhow, when Streb opened a new studio and performance space in Brooklyn, they had high hopes about bringing in new audiences. 5 years later, though, they weren't seeing it. Their audience numbers were just okay, and they were also very familiar, largely white, largely middle class, largely well educated. So looking into this, Streb discovered a big hole in their demographics. They were serving adults and families with kids under 12, but they weren't bringing teenagers in. They were also having a hard time getting repeat attendees. Their assumption was that once people came in and saw how cool the work was, that they would automatically come back, but that wasn't working. So those two things were their insights, right? The need to address repeat attendees and especially the need to focus on teenagers. The invention they came up with was a program called Teen Action Club that taught kids flying trapeze, trampoline, and pop action movement on consecutive Fridays in June. Now, Action Club came complete with snacks and a DJ and all sorts of great things to appeal to kids. They piloted the program and they liked it, and a few of those kids started coming back and started enrolling in other programs, but not as many as they'd hoped. So here's what turned this invention into an innovation, right? Is they went back and figured out what was limiting the market success of that program. What was limiting it? And turned out Friday nights weren't good for parents. Consecutive Fridays were a pain. June conflicted with other school events, and their price point was too high, right? So they fixed those things, and they found out that they could then share that invention, that program, with a lot more kids. They're now drawing a larger audience, and the kids are sticking around, and they've been able to attract new grant funding for the program too. Finally, we'll go to Cincinnati Arts Wave. Used to be called the Cincinnati Fine Arts Fund, one of the country's very first United Arts fundraising campaigns, and they've done a good job of it too, bringing more than $200 million in to the arts over the last 83 years. Now, some of you heard about this in some excellent sessions this morning. I'm going to emphasize some slightly different details, again, through this innovation lens. A couple years ago, the fund started to get worried. Contributions to the arts were lagging, and their old arguments weren't working anymore. The fund needed to change the conversation about the arts in their community, to get residents to start speaking up and showing up and contributing. And so they turned to a special kind of market research called framing science for help. Right? I'm not going to go into the methodology of this. You can get those details online too in the resource packet that you have. But the important thing about this is that that approach helped lead to their insight. That approach helped them understand why their old practices were failing. And here's where they were getting stuck. Residents thought the arts were a matter of individual taste, and that doesn't lend itself to a sense of shared ownership. Art was kind of something to be purchased like laundry soap or some other product, and if it's a product of the market, why should government or philanthropy support it? And there was also a rarefied sense that art was done by other people, like artists, not by real people like city residents. So they developed new messages with better traction. Here they are. They also altered their communications, pushing those new messages consistently in all their materials. They have rebranded themselves as Arts Wave to remind people of the ripple effect. They are also changing their programming to be very participatory, like a Paint the Street event involving 1,500 citizens in painting 6 city blocks downtown. Or Splash Dance. It's a flash mob event with over 300 volunteer revelers, very few of them professional dancers, coming to boogie by the city fountain, right? It's a new transition. The results so far, though, are encouraging. They're seeing a lot more media coverage, and they're hoping that that translates into contributions as well. So what do all these 3 innovation examples have in common? First, all 3 of them provide what Richard Evans calls new pathways to mission. Right? None of these organizations made a U-turn and threw out their mission. Right? But they did find new routes to get there and found ways to see the umbrellas and the gorillas that were standing in their way. They all exhibited a high tolerance for failure and learning. They were all in tune with their unique environment and real and authentic about what their local communities would respond to. Biolinguist Derek Bickerton once wrote that when the environment and genes pull in opposite directions, the environment wins. And I think that's true. All of these examples were finding ways to adapt their DNA to changes in the environment, as well as some of those big picture burnt toast trends that I talked about earlier. All the changes were right-sized, and they were all experiential too. Their audiences could feel the brand and were part of the change. They weren't just spectators. Now, I want to underscore this experiential dimension because it's how we as human beings are wired. Our decisions are driven by all kinds of sensory experiences. This point's illustrated by some market research that reveals how much purchasing behavior is a result of subconscious factors. For instance, it turns out that on days when gourmet food shops play French cafe music, 77% of purchasers buy French wine. Whereas on days where a German band is playing, sales of Riesling go out the roof. Only 1 in 40 people at the checkout counter will tell you that they noticed the music and that it was part of their decision-making process. Here's another example from Martin Lindstrom. In a 2005 study, researchers placed a faintly discernible lemon-scented cleaning liquid in a bucket of water behind a wall. They then recruited 2 groups of test volunteers, half of them who sat in the room with the lemon, and half of whom sat in a different room. Everyone was asked to write down what they planned to do that day. 36% of the lemon room listed cleaning tasks, compared to 11% of people in the other room. Then they did another experiment with 2 completely new groups of people in these same rooms. Each group filled out a completely unrelated questionnaire while sitting in either the lemon room or the non-lemon room. They were then moved to a completely third room, which smelled like nothing at all, and given an extremely messy, crumbly cookie to eat. Hidden cameras observed that the people who had been in the lemon room made less of a mess. Right? They were more fastidious. in their eating of the cookie. And again, when questioned about it afterwards, not one of them was remotely aware of the effect of the scent on their behavior. Okay? Now, my point in sharing this is not to suggest that we all start pumping lemon pledge into our air ducts, all right? Rather, it's to underscore what consumer decision-making is like. Decisions to attend your show, decisions to make a contribution, decisions to cast a vote in favor of your state funding. They're not based on the logic of our arguments, and they're not based on the slickness of our ad copy. They're driven by the total experience that people are having with our work in the arts. Not just our repertoire, but the whole experience. How does our venue feel? Was it a hassle to pick up or exchange tickets? Was the print of the program too small? Did I see friends there? Did I make relationships there? Right? Their full senses are absorbing literally everything about the experience and using that to inform, subconsciously, future decisions. So let's make it smell good, people. That, by the way, is how Maryland got arts education standards implemented in their state, right? They absolutely quoted facts and figures to legislators, but what turned the tide was bringing the legislators into the rooms with the kids in actual classrooms, getting their hands full of finger paint and clay and watching what happened. It was the experiential factor that made the difference there. So I'll move on from cookies to a little more substantial food for thought that may help you as you consider your own innovation future. I will leave you today with 3 small souvenirs from Kelly's Museum of Innovation Myths. Myth number 1, audience research will give us all kind of good ideas. I am the last person on the planet who's going to ever discourage you to do an audience survey, but they don't always tell you what to do. Henry Ford said, quote, "If I'd asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, not a car." Okay? So audience feedback will help you improve your implementation, but the invention is probably going to be up to you. Myth number 2, people welcome innovation. Well, this year marks the 31st anniversary of Post-it notes. Right? My life would not be the same without these little boogers, personally. You know, I think they're fabulous. Their original inventor, Spencer Silver, who invented the low-pressure reusable adhesive, took a very long time to get anyone at 3M, the company where he worked, to pay attention to this invention. They told him to buzz off for 5 years. 5 years. It was finally, the way he changed that was he had a pal in the marketing department that got them to pilot produce a whole bunch of these things, take them to Boise, Idaho, and give them away for free. Turns out that 95% of the people who received the free Post-its said, "Oh yeah, I'd buy a case." And that's why we have Post-its today. So the moral of the story is be persistent. This is especially true for advocacy. Don't let the go-away gnomes get you down. This is another one. Right? There's probably enough said about this one. I don't need to tell you what that means. But let me briefly put it in context for you. Okay? The adoption of Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and other social networking apps all roughly follow what analysts call a hype curve. And I think this hype curve is true for other kinds of innovations as well. Little ones in arts organizations, little ones in artist studios, big ones in multinational corporations, right? I think they all follow the hype curve, and it goes something like this. You start with a trigger, the appearance of a new tool or a new idea. Then you get really jazzed about it, right? And you invest a lot of time and effort and see very, very promising early results. Then we enter what's called the trough of disillusionment, right? Where the buzz wears off, the difficulties mount, and we wonder if we were like truly nuts to be doing this in the first place. And eventually, assuming that the invention is sound, assuming that our insights were true, things even out, and we reach what's called the plateau of productivity, right? There are any number of ways in which I am dreaming of that plateau of productivity. Now, this reminds me of what my pilot said on the airplane that I flew in yesterday, told me. He said, "We're going to hit some turbulence, but there will be some big bumps until we reach our level cruising altitude, and then we'll level off," right? But we face turbulence in the arts, and I don't think that we can respond by fastening our seatbelts and sitting down, right? I think we need to stand up. I think we need to do exactly the opposite. I think we need to make some noise. I don't think we can take what's happening to arts funding in this country sitting down. And I think this conference has given you superb ideas, tools, and information to apply to that endeavor. The passion, however, is going to need to come from you, and the legwork is going to need to come from you. I know that I am the thing standing between you and going home, which is a perilous position for a speaker. So I think I am going to let this be the last image that we have on our retinas for this afternoon. It's been a privilege to be with you. Safe travels on your way home, and thank you.